Hello, History 103. Excuse me, good to see you, at least through video again. First time since last week. I hope you're all well. Before I begin talking about the subject for this week, which is the Year of the Republic, just a couple of notes that I want to make. First, and it looks like almost all of you did, you submitted your midterm exam. So thank you for doing that. A few of you haven't. A few of you have contacted me. If you're having problems doing so, something going on with Blackboard, just let me know, and we'll try to figure out a way for you to do it. But it looks like almost all of you did, so thank you for doing that. And so for the next few weeks, we're on a more or less normal schedule. This week, because you did your midterm exam, I'm not going to ask you to do a discussion board response. Would just like you to watch this video, and this will set us up for the next week, actually the next 2 weeks, as we move into the 19th century and get closer to the Civil War. But next week and the week after will be normal. I'll post videos on Monday, and on Wednesday or Thursday, you'll have to do a discussion board response. Before I continue with today's topic, just one other point I want to make is that I've also posted, if you haven't seen, all of the grades thus far on Blackboard under the Grade Center. So that includes your first primary source paper. So all of the grades are posted. If you have any questions, just let me know. Okay, great. So for today, the topic is the early Republic, and this is one I probably will finish up next week as well. It's a quite large topic. It covers a lot of very important material. So as you can see from the slideshow, which I'll give you a second to pull up if you'd like, it's on Blackboard. Under the Information tab, you can find all the PowerPoint slides. So I'll give you a second to do that if you wish. And if you haven't gotten it yet, go ahead and pause it, but I'm going to continue, just so I don't sit here quietly. The early Republic refers to the years after the ratification of the Constitution. Of course, I talked about the Constitution briefly last week. So the early Republic, I have it dated 1790 to 1820. Other scholars will disagree, just about some of the especially the beginning and end point. All scholars acknowledge that it refers to the first couple of decades after the creation and ratification of the Constitution. One point I want to make now, and this is with reference to the American Yawp readings, chapters 6 and 7. This slideshow and what I'll talk about today is going to go back and forth, or not back and forth, but it will cover material in chapter 6 as well as material in chapter 7. So I don't want there to be any confusion. Chapter 6 of American Yawp goes up to the year 1800, and we'll discuss that today. While Chapter 7 begins with the year 1800, you'll see, of course, that I date the early Republic from 1790 to 1820, just to give you a heads up about that. But we all agree, all of us historians agree, that it begins with the first presidency. So just for a little bit of background, and you've read about this in Chapter 6 of American Yawp, so I'll just talk about it briefly. The Constitution was ratified in 1789, 2 years after it was created. It was ratified by 12 of the 13 states, and it went into effect in 1789. I think many of us know, hopefully, that the first president of the United States was George Washington, and the key theme for the first presidency, and in fact for this entire period of the early Republic, is that of political partisanship, by which I mean political conflict between two emergent political parties. And that's the major theme for today, and it certainly was the major theme of the early Republic, beginning with the first presidency, in which we see that conflict develop in the first cabinet, the first selection of secretaries of the various government departments, of which the two most important were Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. Their conflicts were many, and we're going to discuss them on the next slide. But they essentially broke down to conflicts between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson over how much power the national government should have versus the state governments versus individual American citizens. Hamilton believed that the national government should be extremely powerful, while Thomas Jefferson was skeptical of powerful national governments and believed that local and state governments should retain sovereignty. And this indeed is still a conflict that exists within the United States today. And it roughly tracks to liberal versus conservative today. Not necessarily so liberal versus conservative during the first presidency, but the idea that there are conflicts over how much power each level of government should have, national versus state, continues to exist with us. And that exists through the first presidency, in the first Congress, which had a couple of key agenda items. One was creating the federal government, creating the various government departments, that's developing the governmental structure. One example of that is the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the federal judiciary. The other key agenda that the first Congress had, which by the way met in New York City, is to create a Bill of Rights. Opponents of the Constitution, called anti-federalists, believed that the Constitution should not be approved, should not be ratified because it lacked a list of rights that citizens have that the government cannot violate, that the national government cannot violate. And indeed, that's correct. In the Constitution as originally written, there is no specific list of rights that the national government cannot violate over its citizens. And so this was created, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Some of these are very familiar to you, some of them less familiar, I think. Ones that are familiar: First Amendment, the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. Government can, according to the text of that amendment, violate any of those. The second, the right to bear arms, very controversial today. But these were important safeguards for individual liberties, and in fact something that Thomas Jefferson, the opponent of Alexander Hamilton, believed were wonderful innovations in government when they were created. If you go to the next slide, I'm just going somewhat quickly. The biggest area in which we see conflict and partisanship, which means competition between two emergent political parties, is in economic policy. And this has to do with Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. As the Secretary of the Treasury, which you saw on the first slide, Alexander Hamilton was in charge of financial policy for the first government after the ratification of the Constitution. And he strongly believed in an idea called economic nationalism, that the national government should have a significant role to play in economic development. And moreover, he believed in a model, an economy, a national economy modeled on the British Empire, somewhat ironically. A United States national government that, like the British, would support commerce and manufacturing. You have the economic problems facing the country. This is something we talked about when we discussed the critical period, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much. And Alexander Hamilton's proposals were expressed in something called the Report on the Public Credit, an 80-some-odd page document, in which he basically proposes three key elements. One, that a national debt should be funded, meaning its interest should be paid by the national government, that the national government assume the state debts of the individual states, so in effect combining state and national debts into one super national debt. And that three, a national bank, a Bank of the United States, should be created to operate as the nation's central banking system and to pay or take responsibility for the national and state debts that he proposed should be combined. So creating a debt structure and a banking system for the new United States. This plan was very clearly designed, moving down to the next slide, to benefit people amongst whom Hamilton lived, which were merchants and financial interests in the Northeast. Hamilton, though he was from the Caribbean, from St. Croix, he lived his adult life in New York City, and he saw his plan as being beneficial to New York merchants, Philadelphia merchants, Boston merchants, and financial interests, and at the same time discriminatory against the southern states and western farmers. So his plan was very clearly pitched to benefit a specific group in American society, And it created opposition. It created opposition from poorer farmers living in the western frontiers to the west and to the south. It created opposition in the southern states amongst many slaveholders who believe it unfairly benefited the Northeast. And so this opposition coalesced, emerged into what is called the birth of the first party system, meaning the creation of two political parties which oppose each other. Ultimately, his plan was accepted, and the Bank of the United States was created. The debt structure was created in a compromise that would locate the new capital in Washington, D.C., as you can see. But what's most important about his financial plan is that it created a party system, two parties which oppose each other. One party called Federalists, the party led by Alexander Hamilton, as well as John Adams, who believed that the national government should be powerful, who tended to come from elite social backgrounds, tended to come from the Northeast, tended to believe that the United States should have an economic system modeled on Great Britain, versus an opposition party that used Thomas Jefferson as their figurehead, who called themselves the Democratic Republicans. Just to be clear, and this is not mentioned in American Yop, so I want to make this clear, this name, Democratic-Republicans, does not refer to either of the political parties that exist today. Those are different and were created much later, so excuse me, and I will talk about them soon. But the Democratic-Republican Party emerged as the opposition party to Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. Democratic Republicans tended to be supported by people from lower social backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, people who weren't necessarily wealthy, people who were family farmers living outside the cities in the West and in the frontier, but also in cities by wage workers and laborers, people who were not born into privilege, whereas the Federalists tended to be supported by people who were born into some kind of privilege. And again, this Democratic-Republican Party had or looked to Thomas Jefferson for their inspiration. Democratic Republicans tended to be skeptical of a strong national government, usually supported strong local and state governments, and in general were popular in the South and in the West. So these two parties were the coalescing of the first party system, but more importantly, were evidence that this entire time period of the early republic is dominated by intense dislike, intense competition between the two political parties. Again, political partisanship being the major theme of this time period. So I'm going to scroll down to the next slide and talk about the second presidency. And I'm going to go somewhat quickly through this because I want to get us through to the post-1800 period. But skipping over some major topics that were discussed in chapters 6 and 7 of American Yop, and I'm doing that just for time, but George Washington remained president until 1796, and he served his last years as president, of course, aware of the fact that this party system had arisen, aware of the fact that the conflicts between Federalists and Democratic Republicans had grown quite intense, and frankly being very concerned about it. In fact, George Washington was so concerned about this party system that he gave in his farewell address, his final speech to the nation in 1796, an explicit warning, warning the American people that there are two things that threaten the safety and the security of this country the most moving forward. One, political parties. And there are times when I wish that we had listened to him. But we can't, George Washington said, allow parties to continue to develop in opposition to each other. Unfortunately, that did continue to happen. The other, in fact, is he said that the United States should not get entangled in foreign affairs. which had happened in his administration and would happen during the administration of the second president, John Adams. John Adams, we've referred to before. He was a revolutionary leader from Massachusetts, beginning in the 1760s, a member of the Federalist Party. He had in fact been George Washington's vice president, and he was elected to succeed George Washington on that basis, because he had been George Washington's vice president. And he was elected in 1796, but he faced a very rocky presidency because of foreign affairs. A larger background that I'm not going to talk for very long about, which is discussed in American Op chapter 6, but which is important for understanding his presidency, is the French Revolution, which had surged in intensity and surged in violence and radicalism in the 1790s. Just as George Washington's time as president was ending, it had created a series of problems for George Washington and then for John Adams, his successor. As Federalists, and certainly this is very true of John Adams as a Federalist, Federalists tended to view political radicalism in very negative terms. Federalists tended to be elitist, and they were very, very negative towards, I might even say fearful of, what we might call lower class radicalism. Radicalism rooted in class difference. And this is what had happened in the French Revolution. Back in France by 1795, 1796, the revolution had become radical and democratic. Don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but the French Revolution earlier in the 1790s had led to the destruction of the French class system, the abolition of the monarchy, the execution of the monarch, Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, had led to the abolition of the aristocracy, the abolition of the Catholic Church. It had destroyed these pillars of French society and existed for centuries in a very unequal French society. And this had empowered common radicals, by which I mean people with radical political beliefs who came from lower classes, to believe that there was a world-changing moment in which elitism would be swept away and the lower classes would rise up and secure power. This was something that very much scared John Adams and other Federalists. There was a fear that revolutionaries from France would come to the United States to stir up trouble, and to an extent that was true. There was a fear that the Democratic Republican Party, as we just discussed, would become inspired by the principles, the radical principles of the French Revolution to push for social change in the United States. And this led the Federalist Congress, backed by President John Adams, to pass two acts in 1796 that are extremely controversial, two of the most controversial laws ever created by the United States Congress, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so the context, as I just discussed at some length, the French Revolution, the fear of radicalism, this growing political partisanship between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and combined, these acts limited civil liberties, as you can see, and harmed Republicans. They limited civil liberties, especially the Sedition Act, by giving the president power to deport any alien, non-citizen resident of the United States who was deemed dangerous. Non-citizen residents, aliens of the United States, were in many cases wrongly believed to be revolutionaries who would support the Democratic Republican Party. So the president was given the power to deport any alien he deemed unsafe. And for a modern day context, that is not possible. The president can't decide to deport whoever they would like, as much as he would like to. The Sedition Act applied to U.S. citizens. It said that any citizen of the United States who makes scandalous, the quotation from the law, malicious or false accusations about the government or the president can be jailed. Sedition's another word for treason. And opponents of the Sedition Act immediately argued that it violated the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the right to free speech, and it did. But both of these acts, together called the Alien and Sedition Acts, were clearly designed to harm the Democratic Republicans. And so on this slide, it just says Republicans. Sometimes they're referred to as Republicans. I didn't put Democratic Republicans just to save space, but that does refer to the Democratic Republicans. And it was feared that these would be dangerous precedents, giving the national government far too much power to punish alien residents of the United States and citizens of the United States. And so in response, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison created resolutions that argued, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, for the concept of nullification, right? That states can refuse to recognize national laws they believe are unconstitutional. So this is an important step in United States legal history, and one that continues to pop up every now and again. There are sometimes, and this is most recently with what we call Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, where some states refuse to recognize the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, because they believed it was unconstitutional. That idea was first emergent in these Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So the presidency of John Adams, the second presidency, was one in which we see a significant amount of political conflict, partisanship. And this fed into the election of 1800, an election that pitted John Adams, running for re-election, against Thomas Jefferson. So Federalists, John Adams, versus Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson. And when you look at the sectional breakdown, the regional voting patterns, you can see that two patterns emerge that will continue to exist moving forward. North versus South, which if you scroll down and look at the map, the second image below that slide, we see that green states, states that voted for Thomas Jefferson, overwhelmingly located in the South, from Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and to the South, whereas states in the pink salmon color tend to be located in the North. There's also salmon color states being four, as you can see by the key, the Federalist John Adams. It's also east-west. The farther west to the left that you go, you see more votes for Thomas Jefferson and as the Democratic Republican candidate versus Federalists drawing votes from states farther to the east, from New England, and as you can see, Pennsylvania and one portion of North Carolina. In this election, the Electoral College, as it was originally constructed in the Constitution, failed. The Electoral College, as originally created, determined that presidential and vice presidential candidates would not run on one ticket together, but would all run separately. And whoever received the highest number of electoral votes would win an election. Whoever received the second most would become the vice president. And for very complex reasons that I don't have time to go into here, this system failed. And if you go back down to the map of the Electoral College votes, you can see, if you look at the numbers on the bottom, you can see that Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican vice presidential candidate Aaron Burr actually tied this election, which led to a series of controversies, and ultimately Aaron Burr attempting to, as I say here, steal the presidential election from Thomas Jefferson. Due to a 2-week period of backroom dealing, ultimately Thomas Jefferson won this election, and Aaron Burr was thwarted in his attempt to take the presidency. And this election, the election of 1800, is by some historians considered to be a revolution in American government. Certainly Jefferson believed it to be. if not a true revolution, and I don't think it was personally, it was important because it was the first time that power was peacefully transferred from one party, from former President and Federalist John Adams, to the opposition party, to Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. So this is important. And if we go down to the next slide, Jefferson's presidency was one in which we see some both very important pragmatic changes, and we'll see that when we talk about Jefferson's goals in the Louisiana Purchase, as you see on this slide, but also some very important philosophical changes in American government, which is that first point there, Jeffersonian republicanism. And this political philosophy is the inspiration for a strand of American thinking that continues to exist today. But as you can also read in American Yop, chapter 7, this Jeffersonian republicanism is a political philosophy that emphasized non-elite political participation. And as American Yop calls it, a politics of the masses, meaning that a philosophical change in American government in which the national government, through the instrument of the chief executive, the president, would emphasize, that the national and state governments existed to serve the mass of ordinary voters rather than the interest of elites. To be very clear, in the minds, I should say, of somebody like Thomas Jefferson, the masses, the mass of common people, specifically refer to non-elite white men, not men of color, and not women. And that's a major caveat because, as we'll see on the next slide, the presidency of Thomas Jefferson with relation to slavery is complex and paradoxical. But it is, with that major caveat set aside for a second, this shift towards Jeffersonian Republican did have a major impact, at least on the lives of non-elite white men, because they began to view the government as an instrument to fulfill or to address their interests rather than, as was the case under Federalists, George Washington and John Adams, viewing the government as an instrument merely to serve the interests of the elites. And it's with this background philosophy that Jefferson's goals as president, the second point on your slide, begin to make sense. He wanted to reduce the spending, or as I say here, the size of the national government, to reduce the amount of influence that elites had in the national government. He wanted to to undermine Federalist judges in the national judiciary. So everything that Thomas Jefferson proposed to do as president, he proposed to do with the interests of the ordinary white man in mind. Although ironically, Thomas Jefferson himself was a wealthy slaveholder. He came to be viewed as the political leader of the common white man. And this is how we viewed the Louisiana Purchase, the most important territorial purchase in American history, a purchase made in 1803 of 828,000 square miles, you have the number there, by the United States from France and its Emperor Napoleon. If you scroll down to the map below this slide, you can see that is a massive territorial purchase, everything in green, east from the Mississippi River, all the way into what today we call the Great Plains. Adding about the middle third of what is today the extent of the United States, so a major land purchase. And one which was technically not constitutional, but which was seen to be such a great deal financially and territorial that the Constitution was briefly set aside for a moment. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the government may purchase territory, but that was set aside in order to secure this land. And this led to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark were two acquaintances, friends of Thomas Jefferson's, themselves Virginia slaveholders, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, who were chosen to travel throughout the Louisiana Purchase territory. In fact, if you look at the map that shows the territory purchase beyond it, all the way to modern-day Washington state, so that they could survey it and report on the Native American presence in that region, and also collect scientific data about the plants and animals, given the fact that almost no American had ever traveled in that area. This was an important expedition. If you scroll down, you can see some of the couple of images that pertain to this Lewis and Clark expedition. The first image, if you scroll down below the map, it's the title page from their 1809 publication of their journals. This is called the Travels, but this is journals that Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark kept. On the left, to the left of that, you can see an image of a woman who helped them in their travels, a Native American woman. You've likely heard of her before. Here she's labeled as a Sioux Queen, but her name was Sacagawea. So you can see her in her native dress, and this is likely what she did look like, given the fact that Lewis and Clark did actually know her, and she spent almost 2 years traveling with them. So that's Sioux Queen, Sioux being a tribe in that region, Sacagawea. If you scroll down below that, this is just interesting as a bit of history of science. Meriwether Lewis, as directed by President Jefferson, was given the task of creating drawings of and written descriptions of any animal or plant that he deemed of interest, which did not exist in the eastern part of North America. So what you have here is just one page of a description of a bird, and you can see that he made a quick sketch of the bird's head. And you can try to read some of his cursive back there surrounding the picture. It's just a description of this particular bird, which, as you can see, I'll just read a few of these. A iris, the eye of a pale scarlet red, and feathers of purple and deep sea green and black, et cetera, et cetera. So that's interesting, just a little bit of scientific history of North American flora and fauna, which I find interesting. But this Louisiana Purchase, just to wrap up this section, also opened a question, unintentionally opened a question that would continue to impact the United States all the way until the end of this class, meaning until the Civil War, which was the question of territorial expansion. Now that this Louisiana Purchase area has become a part of the United States, it's territory, but not yet formally states of the United States. In the future, moving forward, would new states to be created from the Louisiana Purchase be free states, or would they be slave states? And this is a question that we're going to return to next week and in subsequent weeks when we discuss the conflict between slavery and freedom. So moving to the next slide, just another topic I want to discuss, and this will be the last topic for today, and then we'll pick up and finish this section on Chapter 7, and then we'll transition into discussing themes from Chapters 8 and 9 next week. It's an issue or a conflict I've referred to already, but just very briefly, about the developments of both slavery and freedom in Jeffersonian America. And Jeffersonian America means, for our purposes here, the late 18th, end of the 1790s into Thomas Jefferson's time as president from 1800 until 1808. Because what we see here is that a paradoxical relationship began to emerge between slavery and freedom in this time period. And what that means is that there's evidence of both the expansion of freedom in the United States, but for reasons that are somewhat complex, but which I'll try to make clear, the expansion of slavery as well. So we see both expand, both the expansion of liberty and freedom, but also the expansion of slavery as well. So the second point of this paradoxical relationship, as the paradox that both slavery and freedom can expand at the same time, is that gradual abolition legislation was passed in New York, as you can see in 1799, and in New Jersey a little bit later, excuse me, in 1804. Arguably, these are the expansion of freedom as these states joined other states which we've previously discussed, states in New England and the state of Pennsylvania, in passing gradual abolition legislation. Why did New York and New Jersey pass it somewhat belatedly? They had larger slave populations in New England states, and slaveholders in New York and New Jersey were able to hold off the imposition of gradual abolition laws. In New York in 1799, the process was set in motion so that by 1827, slavery was fully eradicated from our state, New York State. So that's gradual, of course, because that was a period of 28 years, but still significant, I think. In New Jersey, the process took quite a bit longer, so that by 1860, so 56 years after this law was passed, there were about a dozen people living in New Jersey who still had the legal status of slave. But that meant that about 12,000 slaves had been freed in that time period. So that's still a significant number of people who gained their freedom. So I think that those two constitute an expansion of freedom. The third bullet point, and one that will take a little bit of explanation, is an event that on the one hand would seem to be an expansion of freedom, at least in Haiti, but which in fact served in the United States to further harshen, that's not a word, make more harsh, there we go, slavery in the United States was the Haitian Revolution, which raged off and on, as you can see, from 1791 until 1804. I don't have time to go into deep detail about the Haitian Revolution, as fascinating and in fact as world-changing as it was. I can only talk about it in the context of its effect on the United States. But just briefly, the Haitian Revolution emerged in 1791 as the French Revolution emerged in France. Haiti had been a colony in the Caribbean of France, a French colony that originally was called Saint-Domingue. And as the French Revolution became more radical in France, some other country, it unleashed in Haiti, colony, a slave rebellion that ultimately over the course of 13 years resulted in the abolition of slavery in Haiti and the creation of the first Republican government in the Americas that was led by people of color, by former Haitian revolutionaries. And if you scroll down, you can see two images of the military leader of the Haitian Revolution. Those, they may not look like the same person, but they are the same person, are images of Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. For most of the war itself, he actually died in 1803, but he is held up as one of the primary heroes of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution unleashed freedom in Haiti, at least in as much as it led to slavery's abolition there. But ironically, in the United States, fears of Southern slaveholders that it being the Haitian Revolution, would inspire slave uprisings in American slave populations, led to, as I said, not the harshen of slavery, that's not a word, but led the experience of slavery to become worse than it already had been. Because the Haitian Revolution stoked the fear of Southern slaveholders, that, for example, slaves in the American South would find out about the Haitian Revolution, find out about figures like Toussaint Louverture, and become inspired to revolt. Those fears seem to be, confirmed in 1800, just before Thomas Jefferson became president, in a Virginia slave revolt that today we refer to as Gabriel's Rebellion. Gabriel, a reference to the organizer of this slave rebellion, a man named Gabriel Prosser, Prosser, an enslaved man who lived in Richmond, Virginia, who it seems did actually gain information about the Haitian Revolution and decide to organize a slave rebellion in Virginia. And this slave rebellion was very daring in its plan. The plan was for Gabriel Prosser and 1,000 free people of color and enslaved people in and around Richmond, Virginia, who'd recruited. Their plan was to capture the governor of Virginia, who was James Madison. We referred to him earlier as the author of the Virginia Resolution. He would later become the president. To kidnap, capture the James Madison, the governor of Virginia, and force him on the threat of death to abolish slavery in Virginia, which was the plan. Unfortunately for Gabriel and his co-conspirators, the rebellion was discovered one day before they had planned for it to begin, and it was crushed. But the aftermath is what's most important for our purposes here, which is that this rebellion and the larger context of the Haitian Revolution actually led Southern states to pass laws making the experience of slavery, the day-to-day lived experience, much worse. So here's where we see, for example, states like Virginia and other slave states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, to pass laws making it illegal for slaves to learn how to read, making it illegal for slaves to meet outside of the supervision of a white person, making it illegal for free people of color to mix with enslaved people, all designed to avoid the unleashing of another rebellion like Gabriel's Rebellion, or to prevent an actual slave revolution like that of the Haitian Revolution. Now, also in this time period, and you don't see it on the screen, in 1803, we see the introduction of a new slave state into the United States, the state of Louisiana, the first state made out of the Louisiana Purchase, which you can, if you flip up to the map of the Louisiana Purchase, if you're not sure where Louisiana is, at the very bottom green leg of the Louisiana Purchase, of course, New Orleans, the major city of Louisiana. So we're seeing slavery both expand and become more harsh. The final point, and this is the most paradoxical point of the Jeffersonian period with reference to slavery and freedom, is that we see on January the 1st, 1808, the first moment possible under the Constitution, the foreign slave trade was abolished by Congress. The Constitution, in the so-called slave trade clause, gave Congress a 20-year period after which they could abolish the foreign slave trade, the ability of American citizens to import enslaved people from outside the United States, from Africa or from the Caribbean. And the reason this is so paradoxical is because on the one hand, it might seem like an expansion of freedom. The United States is no longer allowing the slave trade to continue. And that's true. But what makes it paradoxical is that it's also true that what this created, what this foreign slave trade abolition unintentionally created, was a massive demand from the new territories of the Southwest. So if you flip back up to the map of Louisiana Purchase, if you'll notice, not in the green area, but if you see Mississippi territory that is today the states of Mississippi and Alabama, abolishing the foreign slave trade meant that slaveholders in that area, in addition to the new state of Louisiana, in the absence of being able to buy slaves from outside the United States, began to buy them from older slave states, the state of Virginia, most importantly. So what this abolition of the foreign slave trade did, ironically, is create a massive forced migration that we call the domestic slave trade, the sale of human beings within the United States. And as we'll see in a couple of weeks when we discuss slavery and cotton in more detail, ultimately this led to the sale over a 40-year period of 1.5 million people from the upper slave states, the old slave states of Virginia, most importantly in Maryland, to the newer slave states of the Mississippi Territory and Louisiana. So I think that's the most paradoxical, the best way to show the paradox of slavery and freedom of Jeffersonian America. So I'll stop there for now. There are a couple of more slides, as you can see in this slideshow, and so I'll pick up with those slides next week in our video lecture, and then I'll transition into talking about next week's subject, which is democracy in America, subject of Chapter 9 of American Yop. So just to wrap this up and return to the very first thing I said, it looks like most of you, again, have submitted the vast majority of you have submitted your midterm exams. Thank you for doing so. If you haven't, and if there are some technological reasons or Blackboard is giving you trouble, email me and we can figure out a way for you to get that submitted. Like I said, there's no discussion board this week since you've done enough writing for this week with your exam. So just watch this video and be ready to have a normal week next week. I'll post a video on Monday, and next Wednesday, the 15th, you'll have your discussion board assignment. Okay, well, have a good rest of your week. Have a great weekend. Email me if you have any questions about anything, and I will see you next Monday.